it sort of focuses on the SEN perspective. What we're going to look at to start with today is just that background to SEND. So just getting an idea of sort of the SEND landscape, and our sort of main focuses, which is around sort of communication and language. I think is that sort of key theme that I'd like to get you guys to think about today when you're thinking of PSHE, just because of the type of language, particularly sometimes those jargon words and things like that can come across, which can be very confusing for some of our students. So just to try and get you to sort of think around the backgrounds of language. And that also comes down to knowing the students really, really well that you teach, that are in front of you. So just a bit of that background information on SEND. As we said, at the moment, there is currently about 1.4 million pupils identified in the country that have SEND, and that's 15.8%, and that obviously has been rising year on year. That's broken down into 12.2% are on SEND support and 3.6% on the E8CPs. Okay, in terms of how we support a lot of our students, they have said that the budget has risen over the last few years to support with SEND. However, most of that seems to be just covering the deficit that's already there. So just in terms of that, trying to think about how tricky it can be in terms of getting your resources to support these students, because a lot of them do come through with low academics overall for students at SEND, and that is through all the key stage phases, is what the information from the last data is telling us. So something I would like to sort of draw your attention to, the Education Endowment Foundation. They have done a lot of fantastic sort of research into support for SEND in mainstream. This is a project they did very recently, just last year. And one of the sort of key areas in this sort of recommendation, which we sort of want to focus on today, is under that section 3, which is ensuring all pupils have access to high quality teaching. And the reason why we sort of want to look at that one, they sort of have their 5-a-day sort of evidence-based strategies that will support. And again, we're looking at, these are things that we can do in the classroom. Some of them less in terms of use on your school resources financially. But the first one, which is the key one that I really want to touch on today, is around that explicit instruction, and just those sort of clear explanations and how we model information to support our students to make it really, really clear in lessons. So why is speech and language communication skills important? So it is massively important in terms of helping us develop our literacy. And with this, it will breed that sort of confidence, which will breed that education success and our sort of interpersonal skills, which will hopefully help us to forge a meaningful life when we leave school, and then therefore be able to contribute successfully and positively to society. So why language is important for us? If we look at our development, we start off at the bottom there, which is our cognitive development. And then on top of that, that's where our sort of language development sits. So our expressive and understanding of language, our abilities to interact socially, our phonetics, all of that then stems into our reading and writing ability. And then with that, it allows us to be able to access education. However, as we said, if we don't have those language skills secure, then obviously that makes the reading and writing side particularly difficult, and then therefore accessing education becomes extremely tricky. So hence why for a lot of our SEN students, that sort of language skills and development is really key to support. So if we're sort of looking at that and we're sort of thinking of the development of us as humans, the executive functioning skills are really, really key to sort of think about in terms of that development. And particularly when they get to secondary school, we can start to see that some of these skills are starting to develop even further. But at the same time, going back to that sort of first question about knowing your students is quite key. And the language that we use, because often sometimes we might be faced in a situation where we are delivering information to a student and they're not understanding at all what we're saying. And it's just taking that step back just to think, is it that they don't understand, or with their development, they just have not yet got to that place where they are able to understand fully what it is that we're trying to say to them, and therefore is it sort of a change in terms of the language that we're using that might be more helpful and supportive to that student, to allow and support and help them to engage with the activity that we're trying to do. So just thinking about that development overall as a child, where they're at in terms of things like their working memory, their abilities to concentrate, but also, again, their abilities to understand those key languages. Often, a lot of the sort of language skills that we're talking about here, and I will be in a little while, generally speaking, most students develop them in primary school, but often our SEN students, for various reasons, are getting to secondary school, and those skills are still a real big struggle for them and a massive sort of deficit, which makes it then accessing the curriculum even harder. Okay, so again, just thinking of that communication-friendly approach is just thinking modifying the way that we sort of present information can just minimize often the support that's needed. It can help with the understanding levels, and it also supports with memory and attention. So if we're looking at this point about the language that we use, and one that we sort of talk about a lot is the processing ability of our children. Quite often in a lesson, if they're trying to keep up with the pace of what's going on the board, what's going on around them, trying to take their notes, it's just using language that makes it really easy for them to focus on what's happening. So often we talk about the words that we use, that sort of sequential language, the nows, next, is really, really key, because it just takes away those sort of processing. They know exactly what they have to do in the order that they need to do it, rather than if we start using words like before and after, that can create those kind of processing sort of stresses for a child, because they then have to start to sort of stop and work out what they have to do first. So by thinking of that language that we use, even down into those sort of simple sentences, it can then free up some of that space for a child's thinking, and then it will allow them to understand much more clearly, and gives them that space for other things like trying to remember and retain things, rather than trying to purely work out what it is that they've been asked to do. So just on that, how we can be a bit more communication friendly, thinking about breaking things down into small steps, every different step, no matter how small, giving that pause, that slow talk, just allowing that time for the child to sort of take on board what it is that you're asking from them, can be really, really helpful and supportive to them in terms of understanding. Again, we're talking about that sequential language, and also just putting things into the chronological order that you want them to do something. Again, just takes away that need for that extra processing, which would hopefully then allow them more time, more space to focus on more important things that you're needing them to do. And then finally, with that, just to start to think about, and again, we're thinking here today on PSHE, that sort of topic around that sort of gestures and visual supports for a lot of our students, and the research is there around how much visual supports can be helpful and effective. A lot of our SEN students, as we said, struggle with reading, so they will look for those visual aids to gain that understanding. And if we think about it, in the sense if we were to, when we're driving a car, we don't have that time to read a lot of information. Otherwise, we potentially would be getting ourselves into a few rather worrying positions on the road. So we're looking for those signs. It's much easier and clearer when we're driving a car to see those arrows. That tells me the direction I need to go. It's very clear, very simple in that kind of short space of time than trying to read a lot of writing. So our students are the same. When they don't understand the reading, they can't access the reading, they will look for those visual supports to try and help them to access the learning and what you're asking them to do. From our perspective, if you think about it, when you go on holiday and you go to a country that speaks a language that is foreign to you, you most likely will look for those pictures and those symbols to navigate yourself around. If you're trying to then ask someone for something for food, often we generally use our fingers to point and to gesticulate how many of something that we want. So again, we're using those visual supports to communicate to someone when we're struggling to support and communicate with our language skills. And as I said, generally speaking, there has been a fair bit of research into it, but 75% of what comes to us, we have comes through those sort of visual aids. So thinking back to, like we said, the language that we use, making it nice and clear, keeping it simple, taking away some of those processing needs of our students will allow them that time to be able to fully engage in the concepts that you're going to be asking them to think about in those PSHE lessons. This can then be supported through that sort of use of the questioning technique. So again, this sort of levels of questioning sort of encourages that development of verbal reasoning, abstract language, and supports us as the adult to sort of divide complex areas of language into smaller, sort of more achievable bites for the students. So we sort of move from that sort of section one, which is concrete kind of ideas, all the way through to more abstract. And the students need to respond to all of these levels of questions to function easily within the classroom. So if we think back, Marion Blank studied the language used by teachers in the classroom, and she discovered that there were 4 different levels of questions used. Those basic ones, which is asking for those simple concrete information, where then there's more complex questions which ask for abstract information. And this sort of makes sure that your questionings that you can use on the different level of understanding of the students that you have in front of you. So again, going back to that and sort of knowing the ability levels of the students that you have in front of you, you can successfully sort of engage all of the students in front of you and make them feel part of that lesson. So sort of knowing that those sort of level 1 type of questions might be more useful to be asking of your SEN students with their sort of knowledge and maturity levels. And then asking at more level 4, more complex abstract questions to sort of stretch some of your more higher sort of level and achieving students in your classroom. So that looks a little bit like the table that we have here. So generally speaking, 60% of 3-year-olds understand level 1 and level 2. And then 65% of 5-year-olds, generally speaking, understand level 3 and level 4 questions. So that's just putting it in a context. Often, sadly, though, when we get to our year 7, year 8, year 9, we still have some students, because of their needs, that are still struggling with some of those key concepts. So breaking it down, using that language that's very straightforward for them, very simple to understand, but giving them that opportunity to engage in the lesson will also support them. And again, that comes back to, as we said, thinking about the language that we're using, and also knowing the ability levels of the students that we have in front of us. Okay, so since we've talked about language and different levels of questioning, we have a little task for you to do. On the right of your screen, you'll see some key phrases, and I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes now to go through, and you can put it in the chat if you like, but have a go at looking at which one of those sort of key sections that those phrases belong in. And then at the end, I will go through that list with you. So you've got a couple of minutes now to have a look and see how well you can do at matching those phrases to the right level.
I think if people want to put them in the chat, maybe they can put task, the level 1, just the level 1 questions. Which ones are the level 1 questions? Pop those in the chat at the moment, and then we'll maybe ask for a different level in a moment.
This chat.
Okay, and maybe we'll go to the other end of the spectrum. Which ones would be a level 4 question? Which ones would be level 4? Okay, I think Liam, do you want to reveal the answers? Because I'm looking here.
Yeah.
I feel like, because I've seen this PowerPoint and obviously I've seen these questions, so I feel like we're all kind of on the right track. We're all able to differentiate, you know, which one's which.
Yeah. And obviously, I'm sure Rebecca said that, yeah, at the PowerPoint is available at the end. So there is a lot of information probably coming at you today. So again, it will be there available for you to access at a later point that you can go over.
All of the ones here that are identified as level 4 are, yeah. And then level 1, is it A? Yeah. Which one is? Okay, so so a couple, maybe a little bit more confusion between level 1 and level 2. Whereas the level 4 ones were really sort of easy to identify what is a level 4 question. Slightly more difficult to separate out the level 1 and level 2 questions.
Yeah. If I support with a little bit of something to support with that, then if we have a look, here's a picture, and here we've just broken it down into those sort of 4 different levels. So now you've got a resource to sort of use those questions on, which hopefully will sort of solidify a little bit further that kind of point about the different levels of questioning and what they kind of mean. But it's a little bit like we said, if you can see from the picture here, asking, you know, a student, if you're pointing at the line, to go, what is that? It's that sort of basic knowledge that they know that it's a line. Whether you go down to, like you say, your question 4, predicting the changes. So if you were to say, what would happen if the zebra sort of moved a bit closer to the line? because you can't see it in the picture, this is where you're having to use those thinking skills and your knowledge, that prior knowledge, and that's why it's important that we know that kind of level of knowledge that our students have. If you have that student that knows that the lion being a meat eater, if the zebra came a bit closer, might get a bit hungry, would potentially leap off that rock and start to try and chase it because it wants its dinner. You can see that kind of level needs a bit more of a level of thought, because that's not something that you can see clearly from the picture. But by breaking the questions down into those kind of different levels, you can sort of build on students' knowledge and experience to sort of expand and stretch them. Okay, so we've sort of been talking a little bit about SEN needs, and now we're going to try and see how, thinking of all of that language and knowing our students, that sort of level of questioning, how we can try and relate that to our PSHE education. So obviously there are those 3 core themes, which you've got your health and well-being, relationships, and living in the wider world. And then roughly, 80% of that is now statutory, which is your relationships and sex education and your health education. At the end, when we're sort of looking at resources, but I know the PSHE Association website does have some good resources for planning with SEND, and there are some sections of that website that are, you need to be a member to download stuff, but there are also sections there that are free. I am not a member of their website, and I have been able to download a fair bit of information for supporting SEN students in PSHE lessons. So there are some good resources on there that can sort of help you as well, but we can look at those at the end. Okay, so why is PSHE education important for schools? So as I started saying, a program sort of enables our SEN students to sort of develop that understanding, mainly to around leading safe and healthy lives. And again, a lot of our pupils that have SEND are extremely vulnerable, and, making sure that we're giving them those sort of opportunities to educate them and support them, making those healthy choices and those safe choices is extremely important. In our code of practice for SEND, it talks a lot about sort of preparing us for adulthood, and that's sort of about being able to stand on our own 2 feet, so to speak, and manage in society and be able to contribute to society. And a lot of that sort of PSHE education is really, really important in laying some of these foundations, in being able to support us and being able to do that. Okay, so why, again, as we said, pupils with SEND are at greater risk of abuse and exploitation. A lot of young people with SEND face barriers to having personal and sexual relationships, and it's just helping them recognize these warning signs. It's sort of trying to support them in making those healthy friendships. That physical development for SEND students can be out of sync with their emotional development. And I think, again, that's such a key area to think about, and why we sort of talk a lot about knowing the students in front of us. Often we have got students that are maybe in upper sort of end of primary school, or in that sort of middle part of secondary. So either your 10 or 11-year-olds or your 14 or 15-year-olds, and developmentally their bodies are growing at the right rate for their age, but maturity-wise and socially and emotionally, they're a few years behind, and that just makes them, as we said, extremely vulnerable. So just sort of supporting them on that front, because it can be difficult for them to cope with the changes that are happening to their body when they don't have that maturity level to sort of understand and manage successfully what's going on and what it means to them. It's also there to sort of try and help for some of our students to sort of challenge loneliness and try and support and promote inclusiveness. young people who receive quality PSHE are less likely to have sex at an early age. They're therefore less likely to experience negative outcomes and less likely to engage in risky behavior. So all of those things are really massively important, and why this sort of PSHE program and for SEND students is really, really key. So key considerations for you when you're sort of looking at your classroom, it is all around that environment. A lot of sort of environmental sort of support here for the students. So thinking of our layout, the sensory load, making those sort of routines so things are familiar for our students. Thinking about our transition time in and out of an activity. So often our students with SEND need that time to sort of self-regulate. So that's self-regulating going into an activity, but then it's also really, really key to think about how we sort of give them time to sort of regulate out of that activity. The last thing that we really want at the end of a PSHE session is to send them off to be it break time, lunchtime, or another class on that sort of high and sort of a slightly dysregulated, which will then sort of make things quite tricky for them moving forward. So just thinking about how in your environment and your classrooms that you can sort of support them in that kind of coming out of an activity so that they're ready for the next task, particularly if you have been talking about some of those topics that we've just been mentioning and how some of them with their maturity levels might be trying to manage such topics like sex education. Okay. Okay, so those essential messages that we sort of want to communicate to all our learners, and it is across all the ages. We really need to think about sort of, there are some quite grey areas that we wanted to think about how we're going to talk to them about. So like touch, who is allowed to touch us and where. Reporting touch that is unwanted, and sort of that consent and understanding that they can actually say no. That sort of clear understanding between what is private and what is public often sends students, and again, because of the language that we're talking about and their understanding, they will really need this public and private to be explicitly taught to them. Again, like I said, their language skills are not often there, and just being really, really clear with them around what is private and what is public. Because if we think about even this setting right now, I potentially am talking to you from a more private kind of setting, but I am delivering to a very, very public setting. So even that kind of concept for some of our SEND students would be a little bit sort of mind-blowing for them to kind of understand that sort of concept. So putting it into that sort of perspective, just nice, clear and explicit. Again, the online one is always a big point. And just like I said, that sort of private and public, and understanding that what they share and the consequences of that. But again, it's just giving them a very clear, explicit message. And then sometimes it's useful to think about the maturity of a student rather than their chronological age. Like we said, it's also factoring in that physical maturity might be ahead of where they are socially and emotionally. So sometimes look at them more so from that maturity-wise side of things, rather than looking at them and the age that they actually are. And again, that goes back to knowing who the students are that you have in front of you. So some of the different topics that can be difficult to approach with some of our students, and this sort of goes back to some of that executive functioning skills, that they might not have the foundation understanding, they may lack the maturity or the social understanding. Again, like I said, talking about the language that we use, we might be starting too high for them. So just thinking about our learners that we have in front of us and knowing them, the way that you do know them, where that sort of good starting point will be to come in on a topic. That means that you can include everyone rather than having people missing out. And it's key, again, as we know, by having that sort of key language at the start of a lesson, engaging all of the students, you're not losing anyone from the start, and then that would be quite difficult for them moving forward to sort of be able to engage with some of these topics. Okay, so what do SEND students need more of? So most of the time, they need a lot more time to sort of process things. They need that ability to recap and connect to previous learning. And when we talk about previous learning and sort of overlearning, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be in your PSHE lessons. It's sometimes, if you see those students in your maths lesson, if you're teaching a maths or science, there's opportunities to recap and reconnect. And part of that also goes down to that sort of whole school approach to what your sort of school thinks about and views in terms of its sort of approach to PSHRE. But definitely the more opportunities they can get to talk about these things, not just in those PSHRE lessons, is really, really key and really supportive and helpful to them. But if we're looking at those first sort of 4 points I've put there, they are all time related and processing sort of tasks for students. Before we move on to things like the sensory engagement, those real life examples. So again, trying to think of examples that they can relate to, but doing it again in that safe way that you don't make it too personal to yourself. So remember to sort of keep that distance in terms of connecting to your kind of too personal kind of explanation, but making it something that they can relate to in their life. And just thinking about those structured routines so students know what they have the time, to get into a task, so that you do have that time at the end of the task to sort of calm down. As we said before, that sort of transition time is really, really key as well. Okay, so here are some key skills that the organisation MenCap sort of recommended. And as we said, there is a lot of sort of thinking about words that are accessible. There are a lot of tricky subjects and topics in this, and just thinking about the words that are going to be used. And then that often means that often we fall into that trap of using those jargon words or difficult phrases or slang. And this is really, really tricky. And I just wonder if we sort of pause ourselves here and use the chat again to just think about some of those jargon words or difficult phrases that we have probably used in those kind of moments of lessons, and it's been really tricky for our students to understand.
So, for example, Liam, you gave the example of not using the phrase when you're talking about sex education, not using the phrase "jump into bed."
Sorry, yes, yeah.
Because someone on the autistic spectrum would take that very literally and not make the link that jumping into bed with somebody is that you're about to have sexual intercourse.
That's right.
Other examples include things like talking about being high as a kite. If you're talking about drugs and things like that, somebody might take that very literally and not understand the sort of meaning behind it. So what I thought would be really good to do right now is to have a think about topics within PSHE where we might use phrases that the vast majority of students in our class would understand what they mean, but are going to prove really difficult to get your point across to children that would maybe process that information in a different way or not really understand it. So if you could just take a couple of minutes to pop in the chat any phrases and things like that that could be misinterpreted by students, particularly in relation to PSHE topics. So yeah, we've got in the chat here to sleep with someone. Yep. So majority of people would understand that meant to have sexual intercourse, but actually somebody would take that actually you're just actually going to go and fall asleep with somebody. Butterflies in your tummy. Yeah. You're on fire today. Okay. Are there any other things in particular relation to, obviously we've got lots of things to do with drugs. There's a lot of slang terminology that's bandied about to do with drugs and knife crime, and gangs, and different slang terms for different types of drugs. And it's important that we acknowledge those in a lesson, but be explicit that actually these are other words that we use to describe, you know, with the cannabis is the drug, but it's also called marijuana or skunk or whatever the other, you know, resin or the other words, and be explicit that these are other words that this drug is known by. Yeah, great one there. Blowjob. So, you know, using that word instead of, I mean, I would never, you know, recommend using the word blowjob in a lesson anyway. We would refer to that as oral sex. Is that cheffing someone or chiefing someone? I'm now stumped with that. Okay, Adam, if you could, can you explain, please, my lovely, what cheffing or chiefing someone means in the chat? That would be great. Smoking kills, that's a great one. Because also there's also that real risk in a PSHE lesson that you could actually terrify somebody, that, you know, smoking kills. So it's like it's being sort of really explicit that, you know, smoking can be damaging to your body and it could result in this, rather than that catch-all phrase that it's going to kill you. So it means to stab someone, chef as in to stab someone as in, okay. I've not heard that phrase. But yeah, there, you know, there's lots of expressions, as we can see from this, that, you know, could be misinterpreted. So I think, you know, as a takeaway from today, to have a look at the language that you use within your resources, and actually where can you make it more explicit, and not even for SEND students. I think actually just I mean, I've shown that I don't understand some of the phrases that have come up. So it is really important to make sure that all students in the class understand the language that you're using, to be really explicit and to the point, and to use the correct terminology as well is also sort of really important.
Yeah, and just touching on it, I think that's why it's really, really key and important as a school, if you can agree that sort of key language and sort of key terminology that you want to use, because that consistency will then just help to reinforce, and when you do need to give those explanations, it's that consistent message that you're giving to the students. So as a whole school sort of approach, as a whole school kind of target, that would be something that would be massively supportive and helpful to your PSHE program, is to sort of agree that. Okay, so just going back to some of those sort of safety structures and sort of group work. And again, we sort of touched on this earlier, but just thinking about those sort of distancing techniques, you know, providing that opportunity to add, you know, for students, those different ways of learning. We talked about the visuals before and how key they are. So adding things like story, role play, games, that kind of thing can be massively supportive in helping to sort of solidify and make a sort of an idea sort of more concrete for a child, but doing it in that safe way that supports you as well as the students. Some teaching methods that we know have worked. And again, looking at those resources, just having those, you know, apart from the visuals that we've spoken about a lot, but considering using some props, just to sort of make that point more clear to students when they can actually see the physical thing that you're talking about, can really kind of, you know, help their understanding as to how things what you mean, how things work, but doing it in that sort of safe environment is really, really supportive. And just sometimes for some of those key concepts, by sort of going over it in different ways. So by using a visual, next time sort of using a prop, just to sort of help sort of make that more concrete for those sort of for those SEN students, can be really, really helpful and supportive.
I think at that juncture, it's important to make sure that actually, if you are using examples or resources, that those resources are as realistic as possible. I know of a situation where two students who were on the SEND spectrum, who were had SEND needs, got pregnant as a result of, and they couldn't understand why, because, you know, they had used a condom, and when that was unpicked, it was found that they had put the condom on the banana and they had still gotten pregnant, because they hadn't made that link to the banana was a model for a penis. And so the instruction about how to use a condom had not been explicit enough. And they thought they'd done the right thing, and it had sort of far-reaching consequences. So it is really important to make sure that your resources, your video clips, your examples are something that are tangible, that they can take that and say, right, actually, I know how to use that in real life, how to do that in real life. For example, another thing, you know, it's logical to me that once a tampon has been used, you take it out. But I also know of a story from a health professional where a young woman became particularly unwell, and upon investigation, she had more than 100 tampons inserted, because she had not been explicitly told that she then takes them out when her period finishes. And so, you know, there are lots of things that we just assume is knowledge that people have, but it's really important to consider that they've been given the full instruction of how to use something, what to do in that situation, etc., to ensure full comprehension.
And it's going back to the picture that we said, with those sort of levels of questioning, knowing the students that we've got in front of us, knowing that kind of level of maturity. Are they exactly like the examples that Rebecca's given there? If they're more at that sort of level 1 kind of understanding, they will need that more explicit description and sort of support given to them, because they don't have that maturity level yet to sort of do that sort of next phase, which is like analyzing and understanding that in that case it was a model, not this is actually the way that we're meant to do it. Okay, so some more support for us here. Again, we've sort of touched on, often we sort of have a lot of ASD students in front of us, autistic students, and hence why that kind of, you know, explicit sort of explanation can be really key. Some of those kind of other areas that we might not have touched on is, you know, students who are deaf or vision impaired, multisensory. Your schools should have access to advisory support services through your local authorities for those kind of support, and I would suggest that you get them in to come and have a look at your school, your environment, to see what support they can offer from that, how to sort of engage successfully with those kind of SEN learners. So there are those other outside sort of advisory teachers that the LA should have, that can help with those kind of levels that might not be as much sort of thought about as more so our ASD type of students or our dyslexic type of students. But again, just thinking about you know, those resources as a school, going, you know, as a whole school approach. If that sort of PSHE can sort of be there agreed from a whole school perspective, that will also massively support, because that consistent message, that explicit consistent message is really, really helpful for our SEN students. Okay, some of these approaches for dealing with sort of RSE questions or issues of inappropriate behavior. So again, just thinking back to our students and that level of maturity that some of them may or may not have, really key things like staying calm, not turning things into a joke or sarcasm. We sort of say a lot with SEN students, they don't sort of have that level of understanding or maturity. Sarcasm can really fall very flat on its face with them, and they can totally get things misunderstood. So just being really clear, that sort of matter-of-fact sort of approach. Think of, again, the language. What is the key message that you're trying to get across to them? Again, thinking of that age appropriateness. Also, if necessary, finding that moment if you need to speak to them in a more safe, in a different environment, if they kind of need that level of support just to clarify things, is really, really key. And then just reminding students or discussing, confidentiality is always key for them to understand around that topic. It is a topic that can, as we said, bring in a swell of different emotions and different thought processes, and just making sure that you do allow that time for them to sort of be able to process that, because they do process things at a different pace to most students. Just giving them that opportunity to make sense of it in your lesson is really key. And then just trying to also be that sort of mindful person if a student is struggling to get across their sort of question, just to sort of allow them that time to sort of address that, sort of, rather than just sort of brushing over it, but just sort of showing them that you're sort of supporting them will make them feel more confident, because again, their language skills may not be where we would hope they would be, and so therefore sometimes trying to get across their point of view can be quite difficult and tricky. Okay, so as I said, there are a lot of resources out there to support. A lot of the resources that you see on the screen right now, some of these, like the anxiety gremlins, I know we use in our secondary school, but then there's a lot of things here that you'll see work really, really well in primary school as well. Just looking in the chat at one of those questions there. Again, this comes back to, like we said, it's knowing your students, it's knowing the, it is really about knowing your students. And if you have that ability to be able to support them in a much smaller group, sometimes that can be really, really helpful if there's sort of some key concepts that you want to sort of support them with. Again, based on going back to how vulnerable some of our students are, and knowing that some of those concepts are really, really key in getting across, but also making it in that way that you can then bring them back into that sort of whole class environment where possible, to sort of make them sort of feel part of that sort of whole class. Again, that comes down to the students. A lot of late, I have seen a lot of students not take up support offered to them because they don't want to look different. So again, it's around knowing those students and how you can sort of approach them to, if they would be happy to sort of do something in a smaller group, and not feel like they're being the odd one out, which seems to be, from my perspective, working with SEND, particularly a lot since the COVID pandemic, it has been a struggle for students coming back in all sort of walks and shapes, even down to year 10s and 11s, not wanting certain access arrangements because they think it makes them look different, when there's a lot of students out there that need that kind of level of support. So again, just knowing those students and how to building that relationship with them is really, really key, but that can be really helpful for some students and really beneficial, and a lot of them, if done in the right way, will really appreciate that kind of level of support given.
I think we talked earlier, Liam, didn't we, about whether there was value in lots of times students with SEN are taken, you know, they don't go to specific lessons because they have extra time for English intervention or for maths, practicing their maths. And is there value in assigning some intervention time for specific topics? Like, so the question was about teaching sex education in small groups for SEN children. Is there any benefit in those particular topics where they're going to need a little bit more extra time to manage and process things, perhaps after they've had that particular lesson, to then program in possibly some intervention with some of those children to so that they can recap the processes, and they you know, to make sure that they fully understood the concept of some of those things, particularly maybe something like consent or contraception, or you know, when we're looking at lessons on perhaps sort of extremism and things like that, that maybe there is value in having small group intervention for PSHE, you know, where your budget and your timetable allows within your school.
Yeah, like we said, going back to one of the earlier slides about what do SEND students need more of, and it's that recap and connection to previous lessons. And as I said, not just in those PSHRE lessons. So exactly that, if you can find those other times when it's outside of just that, because often they don't come around quick enough. And for some of our SEND students, that ability to maintain and retain information, they need to sort of be having it brought back to them, you know, much sooner than when the next PSHRE lesson comes around. So if you have those opportunities in some of those small group interventions to sort of go over some of those topics, that would be absolutely fantastic and really, really supportive and helpful to the students that we have. Another question. So that was more sort of primary school sort of resources, but again, there are some there that, like I said, we do use in secondary, and then we do have some secondary. So some of the things that we've sort of spoken about today, touched on, there's some good resources here. So if I go with NASEN, that is the sort of main big sort of SEND body. They are a free organization. There are sort of paid parts to their membership, but everyone can sign up to them for free, and there are some certain parts of their websites that are free in resources that they give. Likewise, we sort of talked about some of the stuff from the Education Endowment Foundation. There's a lot of good research out there, and they do have a tool that you can use to sort of look at resources. So you can sort of add things like things that have had the most research taken into them, but also has had the biggest impact on a student for the least amount of money. And it will give you a list of all the kind of strategies or resources out there that sort of fit that kind of thing. So that you can toggle with quite a few of the different sort of tools and that kind of thing when you're looking for support. Lorraine Peterson, as we said, her education consultancy, she does a lot of really good stuff around mental health. If I sort of can just sort of show you, this is her website, and in one of her sections here, under her research, she has created a list, mental health resource list from November. So you can see it is quite extensive.
Liam, it's not sharing that.
That one's not sharing?
It's not, it's just still on the PowerPoint.
Ah, okay. The link is in the bottom of the PowerPoint in the notes section. So if you want to have a better look at that, please go to that, because it will, she has got a lot of good resources on there that will support further with those particular sections of your PSHE sort of curriculum. Likewise, I said the PSHE Association does have a section for planning for SEND. There are some parts of that you do need membership, paid membership, but the section that sort of looks at the planning tool for SEND, I was able to download, and I'm not a member. So again, well worth a look there for some more sort of resources and information to specifically to support with the sort of planning. Because often you've got a lot of teachers that are you're trying to get to support you in terms of delivering these topics to students, and they're not as confident. So that does give a bit of structure around what you can sort of provide and try and make things a bit easier for them to be able to deliver with confidence, which will certainly help students. And
okay,
over to you, Becky.
Liam, thank you so much for that contribution, and for the work that you've put in to prepare that for us today. Really valuable, as you said, a lot of information, a lot of information for people to take away. So our recording will be available on our YouTube channel, which is free access to all, so you can share the link to this webinar with whoever you think will benefit from it. So you will get an email out with the link in it. You can follow us on Twitter at Network PSHRE. And the PowerPoint, as said, will also be available on our Google Drive. The link to that will also be sent out to you. Our next network webinar meeting is about supporting vulnerable learners through PSHE on the 21st of March. And we're looking specifically at how we can support our students in places, our students who are at risk of exclusion. Perhaps you teach PSHE in a PRU or an APEX unit, or what do we do with those students who are constantly isolated or are temporarily excluded and are missing out on their PSHE learning? Some would say that they are the students that are most in need of good quality PSHE. So how are we going about supporting those students? So that's what our next meeting is about, on the 21st of March. Obviously, information about that will be emailed out to you and will be put on our Twitter account and things like that. So yeah, just remains to say thank you very much to Liam for presenting, and to Louis for coordinating. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording now.